Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you here. My name is Natasha Prljević. I'm a co-initiator of Hekler, which is collaborative artist-run platform and transnational community of artists and art and cultural workers that critically examine hospitality and conflict through art programming, pedagogy, residencies, and archiving. Reading group is a part of Hekler Assembly, which has two wings, which is reading group and anti-fear series. And it's a transnational space and a community of cultural workers that as alternating hosts share, discuss, and collectively imagine new ways of instituting based on the principles of self-organizing, community care, critical thinking, political education, distribution of resources, and healing. This particular reading group is a true pleasure, and I want to thank dear friend Anne Duplan for introducing us to amazing Center for Afrofuturist Studies group, including Dellyssa, Kalmia, and John, and for their really generous invitation to alea, adigweme, and manuel, arturo, abreu, two artists who are leading today's discussion and who brought really amazing material, both texts as well as videos and lectures that we all had a chance to get familiar with prior to this reading group. Dellyssa, who is a part of CAS team, has been really amazing with facilitating and organizing this gathering with us. And she will introduce Alea and Manuel, and kind of the artists will take it on from there, opening the conversation with the group. Before that happens, I just want to
one of the lectures
share that at the bottom of the document that I will share again, you have an option to actually share your thoughts, references, and any material that you find relevant to the conversation or structure that can be useful to everyone later, both artists, CAS, Hekler, but everyone included, also all the participants, because it's a live document and continues to be active. So with that being said, I invite Dellyssa to take over the mic. I'm going to mute everyone, including myself.
Hi everyone, my name is Dellyssa Edinboro, and I am a summer intern at the Center for Afrofuturist Studies. I will be offering a background on the CAS and our artist facilitators for today. The CAS is an artist residency program that reimagines the futures of marginalized people by creating dynamic workspaces for artists of color. Dynamic means interactive, supportive, community engaged, rigorous, and inclusive. The CAS also collaboratively produces exhibitions, workshops, and other programs, as well as maintains a growing public reading room and archive. Manuel Arturo Abreu is a poet and artist from the Bronx. They studied linguistics at Reed College. They work in text, ephemeral sculpture, and what is at hand in a process of magical thinking with attention to ritual aspects of aesthetics. They are the author of 2 books of poetry and 1 book of critical art writing. Alea Adigweme is a multidisciplinary artist scholar working in the fields of creative writing, book arts, performance, installation, and visual media. Her creative and critical labors are undergirded by interests in archives, the politics of pleasure, the hyper-invisibility of Blackness, and the lived experience and cultural work of femmes of perceived African descent, all of which have influenced her extensive public-facing work as an interviewer, moderator, panelist, and educator. She earned a BA in Russian literature at Reed College, earned an MFA in nonfiction writing, an MA in media studies, and a graduate certificate in gender, women's, and sexuality studies from the University of Iowa. She is currently a first-year MFA student in the interdisciplinary studio at UCLA. More information about her work can be found on her website, www.alea.me. And so I'll turn it over to the artist who will offer an activating question for the space at this time.
We wanted to get started with a question that's kind of a warm-up. We, in our previous conversation, all shied away from the word icebreaker because I feel like we all kind of get about it. But we wanted to think about the nature of archives. And so if we want to kind of warm up with thinking about what is an archive, what does an archive look like materially, what is its purpose? And that's a question that's open to everyone. And just so you know, I'm comfortable with silence, so I don't mind letting it kind of hang.
I mean, I'm thinking about preservation as like the most obvious function of an archive, and maybe also research, like being there so that people in the future can come and kind of access the same information, and maybe also like protecting a story or a version of a story by kind of collecting sort of material evidence or the visual artifacts of that story.
I think of archives right now these days as sometimes I think of them as possibilities of silence and rejection, ways of inflecting larger like master narratives by refusing access to your own story.
When I think of archive, I think of communal agency. I think of them as a potential communal spaces in which certain truths can be contextualized, and as polyvocal spaces that then become that are simultaneously evidences of existence of polyvocal narratives that in a lot of different kind of contexts are due to be erased.
I was just going to echo something about the polyvocality that seems implied in archive, or the idea of it being some sort of collection rather than a singularity. I think the word constellation came up in a couple of times in the reading, which I think is a really beautiful way to think about archival work.
And kind of follow-up question, where do we envision, and I really love, I've been using the word constellation a lot of late, like just in the last, like, I feel like few months, where like everything is a constellation of something, because I feel like it's a way of articulating a kind of collectivity that isn't inherently a hierarchy. It just kind of is about the connections between things. And so I really love that folks have been talking about the communal aspect of archives, or the polyvocality of archives. But I also am wondering, like, where are archives located? If we're thinking about the kind of ideal or our kind of understanding of an archive, what are the kind of spatial understandings that we have of the term as well? Like, where do these, if we're thinking about communal spaces, communal agency, possibilities of silence and rejection, collecting evidence or visual artifacts of a story, protecting a story, what are the kind of spatial relations that we understand as being part of that as well?
It makes me think about like the improvised dance space I come from Chicago in a performance practice, and I think when the archive of movement is kind of located and stored in the body, it can be something that can be dormant for a really long period of time and then become activated. And that material that becomes activated can grow so quickly in the proximity to other bodies as they're moving around you.
Yeah, for me, archives bring to mind this dichotomy, which maybe reflects the history and present of coloniality, between archive as accretion, like building stuff up, and archive as refinement or distillation, which when archives are stored in the body, that's what the process looks more like, refining a specific set of gestures or refining a specific set of inherited songs, for example. So I think of that dichotomy between a mass or a massification and yeah, distillation.
I guess to that point, like in terms of the physicality, I'm thinking about refinement and distillation. Like I'm thinking about what the difference is between an archive and like the entirety of Google search results, like which seems to also collect or be a sort of database or amalgamation, but without the sort of refinement piece. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a kind of question about intentionality, right? Or if there needs to be an intention behind the creation, like is an archive something that is created or discovered, right? And also just acknowledging that while there might be types of archive that are corporeal, there are also, there's perhaps a more limited definition of an archive, which is one that is housed within academic institutions. And, thinking just about limits of access, I think, is important as well, especially when we're thinking about silences, which somebody brought up earlier.
Yeah, I'm gonna share screen. Because I feel like in thinking about an archive and in the difference, as An kind of brought up, between thinking about, an archive and Google search results and what the differences are. And Kelly, hi Kelly, thinking about intentionality and what the, how intention is a huge part of thinking about the collection of stuff. This diagram I made over the last kind of quarter, and as part of a kind of series of diagrams that I generated as a kind of commonplace book, where I was thinking about because I'm a copious note taker. I have these like little notebooks everywhere, where whenever I go to a reading or a talk or a screening or anything, I'm always like scribbling in the dark or in the dim lights. And so this commonplace book is a collection of things that other people have said when I've been in these kind of collective experiences where I'm witnessing someone talking about their work or someone being in conversation with someone else. And I feel like this diagram in particular is kind of wrestling with some of the ideas that we've kind of brought up in thinking about the kind of colonial connotations and denotations of the word archive, of the kind of nature of collecting, and thinking about intentionality, particularly as it refers to the collection of stories or of artifacts that come from, Black and Indigenous and otherwise like kind of non-white communities. this diagram in particular, you know, has quotes from kind of personal conversations from a talk that Catherine McKittrick gave here at UCLA last year, from a talk that Hazel Carby, I was like blanking for a minute, that Hazel Carby gave, thinking about her own kind of research into her ancestors on the island of Jamaica. And so I wanted to share this as a way of kind of transitioning between our kind of conversation, our kind of warm-up conversation about archives, into our kind of more broader kind of, or more specific, depending on how you look at it, thinking about the readings and the materials that we are thinking through today. And so I'm a talker, especially when I'm nervous, like I am right now, already sweating. And so I don't want to talk too much, but I do kind of want to offer up kind of space for thinking through some of the kind of ideas that I've collected here, some of the ideas that have already been expressed, and any connections that you're seeing between those two things and the readings, the materials that you engaged with today.
So is that our official transition to?
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
So I feel like we're always going to be dwelling in the kind of archive, you know, but I feel like, yeah, we can transition if that's cool.
There's a striking way in which grounding ourselves in the spatial aspects of the archive through your activating questions reflects this idea of temporal power, right? So that may be a good place to start. The process of spatially grounding ourselves was temporal to begin with, right? It took time for us to do it, to answer the questions that you proposed and imagine these spaces and formats or methods that the archive can take, right? So I think it's important to ground our understandings of our constructions of space in that process of, I forget how the reading puts it, chrono power or something like that.
Yeah.
You know.
Or like, yeah. Like power chronographies, or like a power chronological like understanding of space, for sure.
Thank you. Right.
And I mean, thinking about time, something that I noticed in even though I was the one who brought up the kind of spatial question, you know, something that I noticed in the offerings that were articulated in response to that, you know, in response to the kind of initiating question, was that, you know, I noticed that there was not necessarily an articulation of what that space looked like, but there also wasn't necessarily like a kind of clear articulation of time. Like time was something that was running in the background, and it's like I'm looking at my notes, you know, preservation, you know, if we're thinking about preservation, we're obviously thinking about time, but we're not necessarily articulating time in a way that is granular, if that makes sense. So if we're thinking about a collection, if we're thinking about communal agency, if we're thinking about improvisation and the body, if we're thinking about even the processes of like accretion and distillation, like those all have temporal aspects to them, but that are kind of somewhat hidden, I think. And that like enable a kind of glossing over of what, of like how that time is like actually like lived in reality, how that time is actually experienced, and how differential experiences of time affect the way that we go about the process of doing various archival labors. You know, whether that's like something that is very standard, like we're going into the archive when we're writing a straightforward history paper, or we're using archival materials to influence our, you know, our artistic practices. But it's like there's a kind of erasure of the other temporal aspects that's occurring as well.
Right. There's a massive degree to which the maintenance of archives has to do with the time of others, right? And the time of others being in service of that maintenance. So that kind of is stolen time creates the space in that sense, right? So I was really struck by the way that the reading situated that and then circled back and brought back in the idea of those whose time has been stolen or who've been situated outside of time, like homeless people, how they kind of create these subterfuge methods to find legibility or respectability within those spaces to do what they intend to do, but appear to be doing something else, right? So appearing to be deep in study, but actually just sleeping, which is not allowed. So I thought that was really interesting, the way it circles back that way.
And I really love that Sarah Sharma book. And because for me, it was like very eye-opening in thinking about, because my person friend calls me an atemporal person, because like I would not be able to tell you, like if I didn't have a little thingy that said 39, you've been in this for 39 minutes, I wouldn't be able to tell you how much time has elapsed. I wouldn't, you know, if I'm trying to get out of the house in the morning, like an hour could elapse, like it could be 15 minutes. They kind of feel very similar to me. And so I've always had an orientation towards time that in some ways created various experiences of misfitting, or feeling like I was somehow not living up to the, I don't know, the kind of requirements of productivity that I inherited from my own immigrant parents. And so thinking about the Sharma text in particular, these kind of, the understanding of these like kind of temporal architectures, which is a term that she's utilizing to, where she's like kind of very concretely putting together the temporal and the spatial, but then these temporal kind of sub-architectures that exist, as well as a kind of counter to, as a way of subverting these other ways of understanding time, I think help to make more visible if we're thinking about archives, you know, which are in theory this like timeless space that exists in an institution, and an institution's special collection. So it's like the very heart of the heart of the heart, you know, it's like inside of an institution, inside of a library, inside of a special collections, where you have to, you know, go over all of these hurdles, and where we're thinking necessarily often about special collections in terms of the special collections librarian, and their time and their expertise, but we're not thinking about all of the different types of technology that go into maintaining the special collections. We're not thinking about all of the different types of labor that go into maintaining the special collections. The person who's collecting the garbage, the person who's making sure that the temperature control is working correctly, who's always on call if the temperature control starts, breaking in some way. The people who are making the boxes that are archival, like this notion of archival and the ways that that adds a kind of patina of importance to certain types of labor, but that doesn't trickle down to the people who actually make the things that enable that labor to exist.
Yeah, I hadn't read the book before. So it's about like Japan and kind of Japanese diaspora spaces like Vancouver or something.
So she actually does a nice job of kind of jumping around a little bit in terms of time and space. And so each chapter is dedicated to a particular kind of group of people where she's doing a case study. And so she's looking at, Japan, but she's also looking at cab drivers in New York City. She's looking at business travelers in airports. She's looking at yoga teachers who teach yoga in corporate settings. And so she's looking at the ways in which all of these different people are reckoning with time. She's also looking at the kind of slow food movement. And so she utilizes all of these different case studies as a way of thinking through how, this notion of time being sped up is a fiction, because it's not something that actually applies to everyone. It's, and she's also thinking through the ways that, for instance, there's like a hierarchy of whose time is important, and then other people have to adjust their experiences of time and space in order to support the people whose time is considered like the most essential, in thinking about a kind of heteropatriarchal, like capitalist system. It's a really slim read. I chose the conclusion because I think it does a nice job of like synopsizing it, but I would highly recommend it if you're thinking through space and, different types of inequities. it was really kind of revelatory in that way.
Yeah, I find that idea really generative, that this idea of speed up, or, Virilio type speed, is a cultural logic rather than a reality, right? It kind of conceals the time differentials that you're talking about and the stolen time practices that subtend the leisure time of the people at the top, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And she's arguing for, bless you, she's arguing for an understanding of time that's much more relational, where we think of our kind of temporality and the temporalities of other people as being inherently connected, and the understanding of that connection like enables us to think more, I think, concretely more, but also more capaciously of what we're doing to try and like ameliorate suffering and like make other people's lives better. It's like that example she uses of the Vancouver Public Library, which is, this like nice, like liberal space where they're like pretty okay with unhoused people coming in and sleeping and like, subverting the rules and not being able to sleep, but it's still very much, grounded in this understanding of time that's hegemonic and that is forcing people to come up with these like sub-architectures of temporality, that's forcing people to come up with ways of subverting, as opposed to it just being like, hey, come in here and sleep. That's cool, or ride the train and sleep on the train, like that's cool. Or thinking about shelters in New York City, where there are, that she talks about a little bit as well, where there are limits for when people can come in and when people can leave, and how those actually, reinforce the very social and like interpersonal issues that force people to like need those systems. And, it's like trying to address the need, but also like not addressing the need and reinforcing people's need to like find other ways of addressing those needs that they have in terms of support. But I also, and I'm going to stop sharing screen because it makes everybody very, stop share, small. But in thinking about time relationally, that's something that I feel like, that was one of the connections that I was making between the Sharma and the Hartman piece. One of the things I really love, I mean, Saidiya Hartman is just like, I know, I keep this sticky note on my computer that Kiara Amaya Gopi, who's in this room, said once in a Zoom conversation, like, what is the middle ground between sight Black women and no figureheads? And so like, I know no figureheads is a thing, but also if I did believe in figureheads, like, or in like people to put on a pedestal, like Hartman would be on a pedestal for me. But one of the things that I loved about the response that she's writing in this special issue of History of the Present is her, one, like, this is something I want to talk about at a point and like hear from other people about, is her returning to a project that she'd completed previously and not necessarily disavowing it, but her being able to reckon with the ways that her work was incomplete or her work missed the mark, and how she kind of reckoned with that missing of the mark, like in a scholarly journal. But then also thinking about how her understanding of the missing the mark was in part developed by a rethinking of how she approached time. So thinking about her own kind of relationality between, the people and behold, and her writing this essay in the 2010s, and how experiencing that temporal connection more thoroughly, more in a more kind of embodied fashion, enabled her to kind of expand her understanding of the, like, of what is like completely, utterly understandable, utterly ununderstandable, like we cannot possibly as 21st century people like understand the experience of, being someone who was captured and like transported via the transatlantic slave trade. And yet she is using time or she's articulating time as a route for expanding our ability to put ourselves in these people's place a little bit better, a tiny bit better.
Yeah, it's a temporal public, but it's in the longue durée, right? It's a long temporal public. The closeness is felt. It sounds like she feels it in her body, and I feel the same way when I think of my ancestors and non-blood ancestors, right? So she's demanding care in her approach to the archive, and it leads her to this really generous, like, self-critique that, you know, as you're saying, it's a very capacious approach. It's a beautiful thing to see, and I wish that it were more allowed for Black artists to do that and to have a more complex approach to our own histories of practice, right? There's a level at which, you know, I'm thinking of Spillers and idea of Black culture and the critique of the commemorative, right? In this foundational essay from 2003, the idea of Black culture, Spillers talks about how commemoration can position things as past, concealing the ways in which they're actually ongoing, namely the middle passage and social death, right? And so commemoration is this idea of giving us license to stop doing the work. And she argues about the different kinds of spaces that operate in this commemorative halting capacity, right? And so the archive is one of those spaces, right? Hartman kind of reaches her own limits of care and is unable to imagine the collective mourning in her initial approach. So she demands of herself the same care that she would want, right? It's kind of a demand of reciprocity, which I think is really beautiful. And it's a rejection of commemoration. It's a complication of this kind of stultified art object that's demanded of Black people, right? That can't have any nuance or can't be critiqued from a generous perspective rather than a destructive one, right?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just saying what you're saying. Yeah.
No, yeah, I agree with you. And, you know, one of the kind of things, because I think a lot about and write a lot about, you know, like what it takes to have one's, like where the lines are with one's creative practice, like with one's articulation of ideas, or one's like wrestling with particular ideas. It's like, where is the bridge too far where people will then like be like, you are like, I don't believe cancel culture is real, but like where you are like canceled, you know. And so I wonder about like what it means to be able to have a more like, I keep going back to like the word capacious, but it's like a more kind of capacious understanding of what it means to evolve, what it means to learn more, what it means to make work that changes, like how to also deal with work that you made previously where, you know, your heart and your intentions were in the right place, but, you know, the culture has moved, like scholarly thought, like, you know, theoretical thought, like whether that's coming from like the ground or the ivory tower, it's like where that's moved and where you have to reckon with the previous iterations of your cultural work in public, you know, because people are always going to be calling you to account. And in one of my classes in my PhD program that I like dropped out of, you know, like one of my professors like started off the semester by saying, you know, we can read a reading and find what's wrong with it and then dwell in the space of like ripping it apart and like talking about what's wrong with it. But like, how do we approach our jobs as critics, as, you know, critical thinkers, as humans living in community? Like, how do we approach that process of critique in a more generous way that enables us to, you know, talk about what we see that's not working optimally, but that comes from a place of, you know, as opposed to, you know, I guess if you want to like put it in a very like surface way, like that comes from a place of like calling in as opposed to calling out, you know, like not taking every single scholarly or artistic absence as a slight or coming from a place of malice, but sometimes, you know, as Hartman does really beautifully, coming from a place of just like not being there yet in your thinking, you know. And I feel like that's a spectrum that exists between what another professor of mine Daryl Wanzer Serrano, who wrote a really wonderful monograph about the young lords in New York. He's a communication studies scholar, but he talks about disavowal because he disavows some of his previous scholarly work, and he does that publicly. And so I feel like it's a spectrum between disavowal and like a complete acceptance, and there are a lot of different steps that exist between those two things, but we don't necessarily have like the examples like what Hartman gives to us of what it looks like to kind of take that middle ground and to approach one's previous work with that type of generosity. That, I think, is also a model for how to approach the work of other people. Kelly, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like this conversation is really fruitful and wonderful to listen to, so thank you. And I was also just thinking a little bit about how this willingness to reconsider or do some revision feels like the wrong word, but acknowledge growth, I suppose, also feels related to the idea that comes up in several of the readings, right, that any interaction with the archive is also tied to the present moment, not just the moment of the archive's birth, whatever that would mean, right? And so if you're already thinking about the archive itself as a dynamic entity that is going to change with, depending on who is accessing it, or a thing that comes into being, right, with its moment of access. And I think that also makes the kind of ethic of constantly being open to growth necessary, right, if you're going to be doing archival work, because the archive, then you need to be acknowledging that you're not the same person you were reading the archive 2 weeks ago, nor is the archive the same being read, right? And it seems like both Hartman and Ramirez,
yeah,
that's
the
name,
Ramirez.
have a sort of sense of, thinking about a kind of creative engagement with the archive in that way. And I would love to just, I'm really moved and excited about Hartman's idea of a kind of subjunctive way of being in the sort of research, especially in the gaps that one encounters, right, during doing archival work, and what that does for imaginative production. And I would love to hear people talk more about that. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Kelly. That's a really great offering. And I feel like the resonances between, because I didn't read Manuel's offerings before I kind of submitted my own, and then like kind of rereading the things that I submitted, and then like engaging with Manuel's materials. No, it was just like, wow, everything is connected. It was so wonderful to see, because I feel like Ramirez does such a wonderful job, and I'm like looking through the text. I feel like she does such a wonderful job of articulating the fact that, like, any other inferences I have about the image reflect my desires as well as my subjective and affective knowledge. And like understanding that our subjective and affective knowledge is like spatio-temporally determined, and that it's never going to be the same, day to day or like week to week, I think is so important.
And that when we're imaging the present, this idea of the present in the context of a temporal public, we're imaging an idea of the present that has to do with a constant navigation or dealing with the friction of temporal differentials, right? Of people all entering with different histories of oppression related to time and stolen labor, stolen affect. So this idea that the present itself is a kind of navigation or co-creation, I think is really fruitful, right? But not only because it acts as a call for us to look at the archive in a form of care, but and also understanding that care as a kind of refusal. Like I'm reading Hartman and Ramirez as resonating in this idea of refusal of service in a sense, right? The archives have a very functional role in their original context, but they have these kind of paratexts under them that can be reflective of the caring or critical as caring approach of a certain kind of archival, right? I guess, a speculative archival, we might call it, or subjunctive archival. Like it's both doing the refusal of service and then also finding within that refusal the ability to do the work of care, which I think is really powerful and very, it is contemporary. It's a thing that wasn't possible for a long time, I think, right? When I think of the care work of the writers of slave narratives, for example, Equiano or something, or Harriet Jacobs, Mary Prince or something, they are all still doing the service. They're doing some kind of service because they had to, right? So the position that Hartman's in, she's fully aware of her distance from the hold, felt very closely, but still understood as outside of the circle, as Douglas would say, right? So yeah, it's a really fruitful way of understanding this idea of navigating the frictions of temporal differentials and refusal of service.
Yeah, because something that I really appreciated from the kind of resonances of our respective readings is, I feel like one of the things I really love about the Hartman piece is this kind of reckoning with past labor and, past like scholarly labor that's like influential at like as fuck, it's like, it's up there, in terms of the way that it's been taken up and used as a kind of guiding star for a lot of people. But for her to kind of go back and say, well, like here's something that I wasn't actually considering, and here are the kind of scholars who have helped me to do that. I think that it's, part of the kind of limit that she's talking about, and this is like going back to the Sharma, she says, and I'm on like 146, while publics are currently almost solely understood as spatial constructs, they are also temporal. That publics have power chronographies necessitates a balanced conception of public space-time. To recognize the power chronography of it all is to acknowledge that time is a structuring relation of power exercised over the self and others. And I feel like that understanding of time as a structuring relation of power, that's for me, like that's part of what Hartman is saying that she missed. I mean, she's perhaps one of the most, capable people to approach the kind of work that she's doing. And yet like that understanding of time and how time and her, her privilege of like existing outside of the circle, her privilege of existing in the 20th century, like that is itself like a place of privilege that made invisible to her another facet of humanity, another facet of the kind of lived humanities of the people who existed in the hold. And so that for me was such a helpful way of thinking about this notion of both like thinking about the things that are invisible to us as artists and scholars and cultural workers, but also, this notion of refusal, like the way that, and I feel like Ramirez does such a wonderful job of kind of talking about those three types of refusal, Monte refusal at the end of her article, where certain types of refusal are going to be invisible to people who cannot see it. All they see is the typology, right? All they see is the photograph that confirms the things that they thought they knew about insert group X here. But different types of refusal, that aren't just, as Manuel says, like, I think quoting Sharp, there are types of refusal that aren't just like, right, I have like so many pieces of paper because I'm like a paper person, but that aren't just like part of the big narratives of fugitivity and marronage, like there are so many things, so many types of refusal, so many kind of micro resistances that, if you will, that exist at a kind of micro historical, like interpersonal level that we cannot see if we're not thinking about how those types of refusal might look. And that has to be grounded in, I think, a temporal understanding of a particular time and place, which is something that I think Ramirez does a really wonderful job of kind of articulating, particularly by putting, her family photo, her own, like, a submission from her own archive into the conversation as well. It's like, what does that refusal look like? And I wonder if an understanding of the different types of refusal is something that can be taught, or not taught, but it's like, how do we learn to see types of refusal where we don't have a family photo that we can like bring into the conversation that enables us to have an understanding of how a particular kind of cultural artifact is temporally and spatially bounded, right? Does that make sense as a question? It's like, how do we learn to see refusal in situations where we don't necessarily have a personal or ancestral stake?
This is a great question. Also, with the context of her family, she's got other work that she writes about the kind of color split in her family, right? The phenotypical difference and how her like light-skinned family is kind of allowed more of a range of affective gestures and stuff like that, more wayward lives, and her dark-skinned family, her paternal family is or maternal family, sorry, the photos that she had in the archive, that these people had more of a kind of requirement or expectation to fulfill different kinds of farces of citizenship duty, right? Like being police officers, joining the schools and being teachers, joining the government administration and all this stuff. So she's got, and that would be a specific thing about the history of the Dominican Republic, right? Which, I mean, we've had Black presidents from the beginning, so it's not that big of a deal for us. And they too, like Obama, were very violent. So, right. When we're thinking of these totalizing narratives, that sharp quote she is drawing on disgraced abuser poet Derek Walcott, but it is a useful quote, that there are alternative narratives or texts or tropes, chronotropes of understanding what's happened in the Caribbean and happening today that don't rely on these totalizing narratives of marriage or fugitivity. Because the maroon is kind of pictured as a hero a lot of the time, but these people were doing things like operating as slave catchers, for example, right? Operating as catchers of Taino Indians in Hispaniola. So it's complicated. You have to always complicate these heroic great man images that are presented from whatever aspect of the archive, the colonial archive, the Black Uplift archive, right? Patriarchy is kind of imbued in all of it.
I'm thinking a little bit about your question, alea, about how you would sort of be able to read refusal without a kind of personal personal connection. And I think it's a really hard question. It's also interesting because, you know, Ramirez uses Bart, and I think, you know, Bart has this idea that like something about the photograph like grabs you, right? And it's like corporeal, and I'm not sure he would say that that's, I don't know quite if he would say that that's, I wonder if he would make a universalizing claim about the potential of the kind of desire that he sees captured in a photograph. And I think that's something that's would be up for debate. But my memory of camera lucida is very much that there's a kind of punctum and it reaches you, and that's like the energy of the photo, right? But I was also thinking about how helpful it is to actually know the typology in order to identify when it's functioning, right? So knowing, for example, just what the racist caricature of the mammy looks like and is meant to sound like, I think helps identify that trope, right? And also helps to see disruptions or disturbances that inevitably exist below and within the presentation of that trope in archives like these that are collected and organized by hegemonic forces, right? So that would be one thing that I'm thinking about.
I think that's a helpful tool for being able to read refusal. It's like being actually familiar with the different typologies, like being familiar with, like, you know, if one is choosing to work with historical or even contemporary, like, cultural artifacts or products that are, you know, dealing with, you know, communities that have been racialized as not white. It's like being familiar with, like, the history of, you know, white supremacist patriarchal depictions of those people would facilitate an understanding of refusal, for sure. It's like being grounded in the history and, like, the history of images and visual culture. Like, what other tools might exist for being able to read refusal in addition to being grounded in the history of visual culture?
Maybe a knowledge of how those tropes circulate away from their origins, right? So Ramirez hones in specifically on this exporting of anti-Black American tropes to a different place, right? And how that negotiation looks in the visual archive. So learning the history of that could be useful as well.
Mm-hmm. Having, like, a very, I think, an inherently transnational understanding of both, like, the typology, but also, like, the kind of history of visual culture, and thinking about, like, the circulation of these images. It's like, yeah, also really great. It's like, I feel like, you know, Krista Thompson in her work thinking about postcards in the Caribbean and how those postcards are circulated, how they circulated particular understandings of both the people and the landscape that were used to sell those people and those landscapes to European, you know, heteropatriarchal, colonialist, imperialist, you know, customer base. It's like that, I think, is a really helpful way, like, thinking about the circulation, because none of these things exist in a vacuum or alone. It's like I feel like people talk about globalization as if it's a thing that happened, like, starting with, like, Ronald Reagan closing factories and sending, like, factory labor to other countries. But it's like globalization has existed for such a long time, for centuries. It's like we can think about, like, you know, imperialism and colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade as, like, globalization. We can think about various types of routes of exchange, both of knowledge, but also of goods and services as a type of kind of globalization as well. And being attentive to those circuits, I think, is super, super fruitful, because it also, you know, one of the things that Sharma says, I think that it enables us to think about the connection between the local and the global, when those are typically understood in a very binaristic way. But we can understand it as a kind of continuum that can exist in the same place at the same time. Like, these kind of iterations or manifestations of kind of locally specific things, but also kind of global circuits of commerce or ideas or people.
Right, because the reason I was thinking that is I think a lot of people parrot the maxim anti-Blackness is global, but then don't go on to kind of develop a history of the specific circuits that were and are involved in the circulation of these tropes, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of which, but not all of which, originate in the U.S. and spread outward through the processes of imperialism and neocolonialism.
And the notion that, like, anti-Blackness is global, I think, elides, you know, thinking about elision in a, I think, unproductive way, as opposed to, like, the kind of productive ways of thinking about elision that Ramirez talks about, where it's like, if we just think about anti-Blackness being global, then we don't necessarily have to think about the ways that anti-Blackness takes root in a particular place and then is, you know, enmeshed with the very, like, with, like, local particularities, and then has, like, particular manifestations, like particular kind of facets or, like, cultural, you know, characteristics, like depending on where it's taking root. So it's like anti-Blackness in the US like doesn't necessarily look the same as anti-Blackness in Brazil, even though those two things are very much like connected, like, and can never be like unconnected. It's like the, you know, terrain. If we're thinking about like groundedness in space, it's like we actually have to think about like terrain. We're thinking about geographies, you know, we're thinking about all of the different kind of cultural and human forces that come to shape how anti-Blackness is articulated in a particular space and time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm also,
Yeah.
sorry. I'm thinking about like in relation to the temporality and the directional architecture and the invisible directional architecture and how it actually relates to the kind of like visible, intentional focus on the economy, economy of distribution, economy of labor, and as well the commodification of images. And I completely agree in terms of how we contextually and like locally ask questions and see these questions when looking at images, especially when it comes to the kind of interference and the leading role of governments in shaping our reading of certain imagery and creation of bias in order to perpetuate this kind of like complicit communities. And we had conversations before with Jelena and Rashmi as well, in terms of how these mechanics actually unfold. And when we see the perpetuation of bias and normalization of dehumanization, it actually does come from the regime-enforced complacency and regime-enforced communality that revolves around the certain exploitative economies. And I really enjoyed. I like to think about the temporal architecture temporal architecture as imposed and embraced inner directional architecture, and how it refers to exploitation and order, and just the normalization of order as a process itself, and as a correctional process, which is both directed towards self and the others, and especially in the context of as well policing. When we talk about policing and of like seeing ourselves in relation to as a like kind of centering ourselves as a norm versus whatever is outside of the norm to be corrected. I think also looking at the images, it is important to kind of like articulate our own position within this economy, and what is actually skewing our vision and ability to read them in a more complex way, like not complex, but more critical way. And also like related to kind of like anti-Blackness and thinking of refugee crisis, how different governments are actually kind of using the hybridity, kind of like propaganda hybridity that merges xenophobia that comes through religious apparatus, as well as economic and kind of the apparatus of impoverishment and exploitation, to actually intimidate, to use race as an intimidation tool that is then like tied to one's existence or survival within that economic context. And that's something that has been as a like definitely one of the driving tools for racial capitalism, that enables actually the facilitation of somewhat kind of like functional massive displacement that is happening right now. But also, just one more thing, and I think it's also a question. I thought like the writing about slowness, and I'm just going to read this one sentence, like, this temporal architecture continuously confirms and maintains the same structures of power that drain, tire, and exploit other people's time while elevating one group's sense of temporal importance. And it made me think of slowness as this like commodity, which is like amplifying this temporal importance and like individual importance, where time doesn't actually fit into a larger economy of time, but it's actually this kind of like individuated sense of self that fits into the kind of like neoliberal like self-care, and which is like later it's written how it actually fits into the idea of the bodies that are meant to be preserved, which are not existentially threatened, but they are the ones that actually facilitate the exploitative system. But I guess my question is also like in terms of when we see images, how are we able to see time as resistance in them within the kind of context in which, like in and out of the context in which the images are being created, but just can we assume resistance in the image?
Slowness is more like failure than mindfulness, right? When it's assimilated into the corporate structure, it's mindfulness to make the worker more productive. But when you actually let yourself be slow, like we look at Hartman, for example, and the slowness of her critique. She gave herself the time to come back to an older work and understand how her understandings of care had developed, right? It's because she gave herself the time, or she demanded that time of herself and demanded the slow process of engagement with that archive and with engagement of her own initial engagement, right? So yeah, slowness to me looks more like failure when it's successful, if that makes sense. Like it has to do with lateness and not being on time, being out of time, right? Yeah.
I mean, I really love that slowness looks more like failure when it's successful. Vis-a-vis thinking about kind of cultural production and the ability to go back to one's work after a period of time because you've spent that time thinking about it. Like, I don't know if, I mean, I feel like in some ways it's like one needs to be a person, a scholar, you know, a cultural worker of Hartman's stature in order to be able to do that. You know, that's like not something, that's not a failure, that's not a alternate temporality that's open to a lot of people. And like I say that as somebody who's been working on the same damn book for like 10 years, you know, like that's not where I just like, you know, feel this pressure where some of my colleagues have already like published 3. It's like that slowness is not something that necessarily is, you know, framed as something that is anything other than a failure. But I also see the ways in which, like, if we're thinking about slowness as a commodity, you know, Sharma talks about the ability to spend one's weekend like hanging with the fam because somebody else has spent their time during the week doing all of your lawn care chores, right? And so like the necessity of utilizing other people's time and labor and space in order to like have those moments of like self-care, in order to have those moments of slowness. But I want to go back to something you said, Natasha, about, you know, the importance of articulating our own position within an order, and then thinking about what is obscuring our ability to read particularly images in a more complex way. And I feel like that is, you know, kind of going back to my question about, you know, how we develop the skills to read resistance or to read, you know, refusal in images where we don't necessarily have like a kind of cultural background. Like that maybe is the first step. You know, if we're thinking about grounding ourselves in the kind of historical, like the history of like visual culture vis-a-vis a particular time and group and people, it's like our very first step perhaps is like thinking about our own positionality in time and space and culture, because that I think enables us to have a more, I think, kind of concrete understanding of where our lapses in understanding might be, you know. But it also, like, in some ways it might not, like, kind of thinking about what I said earlier about Hartman being like the perfect person to kind of see the humanity of people in the hold, and yet like she did not understand like this like temporal aspect that made invisible the care and the mourning that humanity would have necessarily, you know, it's not even conjecture, like would have necessarily like entailed. You know, thinking about, it's like some of the work that I shared with the Rosalind Forbes Adigweme Memorial Library, it's like that project started in a lot of different weird ways, but it also, you know, stemmed from me kind of finding in one of my late night Googlings a kind of ship manifest that showed that my great-great-grandmother came to the United States in the 1920s, which is not something I had known before, because my mom came from St. Vincent in the 70s, and her grandmother, my great-grandmother, who helped to raise both of us, like came at that time. And so that understanding that there were, you know, 3 trips back to St. Vincent, you know, in the 1920s and 30s, and then on that last trip back, you know, she checked that she did not intend to go back. And the fact that she had like left my great-grandmother there to raise not only like my great-grandmother's children, but also the next generation of children, you know, I assumed that it was because, well, like New York City was dangerous in the 20s. You know, that first manifest said that her cousin, who she was going to live with, lived in Brownsville, you know, which is still a neighborhood in Brooklyn that has particular connotations in terms of race and class. But in the 20s and 30s was like the home of like the organized crime syndicate, like Murder Incorporated, who, you know, if you wanted to guess what their business was, like what it says on the tin is the case. And so for me, it's like, I was like, well, obviously New York was dangerous and that's why she left her daughter behind. But there was something in starting to do that research about New York at that time that made me think, okay, like maybe I should actually try and figure out like what St. Vincent in the 1920s was like. And that was the beginning of this actual project, because I realized like St. Vincent in the 1920s was fucking dangerous as fuck. You know, for my great-grandmother who, you know, her dad was Scottish. I don't know, you know, nobody talks about him or about how she was conceived, but, you know, like she was a very, very light-skinned woman, and you know, her mom was unmarried. And if you're putting together like all of the different shards of understanding, it's like, you know, my own kind of projection about New York and my own kind of projection about St. Vincent kind of clashed in a way that like just didn't match what I was starting to find. And so I feel like part of my, you know, and I wouldn't have articulated it in this way at first, but it's like this notion of articulating our own position within an order. It's like my own position within the order, both temporally and culturally, made invisible to me the dangers of St. Vincent and the predation that was very common for all women of perceivable African descent at that time. And so I, you know, had this imaginary understanding of it where it was just like idyllic and safe and rural and undeveloped. And that is part of like my own kind of internalized, like very like, you know, like kind of nationalistic, but also like temporally specific, culturally specific understanding of, you know, my positionality versus the positionality of my female ancestors in this place. Does that make sense? At some point when I just like start talking, I feel like I'm rambling, but
No,
hopefully
it makes complete sense.
that all makes sense.
And it's
You
a
know?
really generous offering. And I'm happy to reciprocate a little bit. I've been doing some specific research thanks to this Afro-Sephardic scholar, Dr. Jehonatan Eleazar de Mota. He's from the town that my maternal grandma's from in the Dominican Republic, a town called Bani. Bani is in the southwest of the Dominican Republic, maybe 2 hours west of the capital, Santo Domingo. And so what this doctor's research has taught me is that this town was founded by a bunch of crypto-Sephardic people who mixed with both free and enslaved African people. And they practiced Judaism in secret. You know, they were crypto Jews, so they publicly converted to Christianity, but in secret had Sephardic customs and a temple and stuff, and practiced the Sabbath and stuff. And so it's been, you know, I just thought my mom's mom was Black. We didn't know anything about her having Sephardic roots at all. But I was struck reading his paper, A Hidden Ethnography of the Banilejos. Banilejos are people from Bani. This paper felt almost like a violation of privacy or something because it was so specific about the customs that it described that from my own kind of cultural biases and blindnesses and desires, I had perceived as just, we call it cabuloso, just things that are like villagey or rural superstitions or stuff, right? And also, I just don't know that much about Judaism, so I had that blind spot as well. Not blind spot, sorry, ignorant position of knowledge, lack of knowledge. And so finding this out, reading this paper and seeing these customs described and, positioned in the correct context, which is the Inquisition and Sephardic people fleeing Spain and Portugal to North Africa, the Middle East, Canary Islands, and Latin America, and the different kinds of navigations that went in there. Some of them were slave masters, some of them mixed and went to rural communities. Again, dipping into this kind of marriage narrative as part of that as well. Some of them were just living public Catholic lives and practicing Judaism in secret. Some of them lost that connection entirely, right? So that would be my family. My family lost that kind of Judaism identity, even though the customs survived up until my mother, right? So my mother was doing some of these things. She was, in her generation, they would cover the mirrors when someone dies. They would bury the dead within 24 hours of passing. When they cut their nails and hair, they would bury it in the backyard to kind of ward off any spells that could be done on those organic materials. One of the most interesting ones, they were, like my mom's generation and her mom didn't count stars. There was a taboo against counting stars because it gave you warts. So this is when it was the most villagey, the most cabuloso thing, right? We were just like, what is that? Like, and so Dr. De Mota expertly shows that this starts in the Inquisition. Spaniards and Portuguese are able to identify Jewish people through star counting, which was used to identify when the Sabbath sundown would start. And so Sephardic people developed a protective taboo, right? They said that if you counted stars, you get warts. So it kept people from doing that. It was this kind of benevolent disciplinary thing. And so, yeah, my grandma believed that. My mom believes that. I was taught that. And we just always, we're just like, oh, that's a weird thing. And so this word cabulosa in Spanish, I just always said it and didn't look into it. The root of it is Kabbalah. So this stuff was already in front of me the whole time. I just didn't know. Right. And so there's been this long or slow process of thinking about what that means, like from whether it's for my grandma or for me. I'm not a Jewish person, but having a Jewish maternal line is a really interesting thing. Like an Afro-Sephardic lineage from the specific town and these specific customs that are, De Mota himself describes his research process as like mimicking the Inquisitors or something. So he's recognizing the violence that goes into the identification because these people were trying to remain secret, right? So secret that the identity was lost, even if the customs remained, and kind of got assimilated into an idea of village practices. Sorry, I'm rambling. But yeah, I have a resonance with what you're saying and the specific kind of archival experience of this one town, as well as a different town, Aswa, where some of my grandma's relatives are also from, and was also founded by Afro-Sephardic people. So yeah, it's just been a really interesting year of discovery on that and digging into it more. My great-grandma, my maternal great-grandma, didn't have what's called in DR a cédula, like a citizenship number. So she was a fugitive person. We don't really know how to locate her in the archive. I have one marriage record of my great-grandparents. They got married in 20 years into their marriage so that the kids could get the dad's last name in 1944, which is just a very weird year to do that. But yeah, so I resonate a lot with what you're saying and the idea of these specific places and nexuses of places, right? For example, New York and St. Vincent, or Bani, Santo Domingo, and Madrid or something, right? Yeah.
Thank you. That is so fascinating to me. And if you don't mind, if you can like pop the name of the scholar so I can find that paper into the chat, that'd be great. But I feel like something that you said about the way that reading that paper felt almost like a violation, like it both like satisfied your desire to know, but it also felt like, because it was so specific about these things that people really wanted to remain hidden, almost like problematic. You know, I'm thinking back to, maybe because I just like have it right here, it's like the diagram I shared earlier, and this is from Catherine McKittrick, you know, where she's talking about gathering as a method to capture someone, and gathering as a method to question the desire to and act of trying to capture something else. And so if we're going back to the very beginning, our understanding of archives and collection and gathering and what that gathering is for, you know, gathering and archives, museums have often been used, or I think like historically, like are a method of capturing people, but like flattened versions of people. It's a technique that is utilized as a complement to other types of erasure and like genocide. But gathering can also be a way to think through the desire to capture, like think through the act of trying to capture something as opposed to someone. And so this notion of kind of gathering and archive and collecting knowledge and trying to flesh out our understandings of whether they're our own kind of objects of inquiry, or whether our objects of inquiry merge with the personal and the ancestral, the genealogical for us. You know, there are some things that, you know, McKittrick said the unknowability of what is in excess of the text does not have to be tracked down and documented, which is something that really resonated with me as I kind of negotiate this understanding, or this kind of process of figuring out what should be concealed or made obscure, or made, you know, what should be elided, to use Ramirez's language, and like what should be shown, you know, as I'm thinking through the process of archival work, which requires, you know, reading along and against the archival grain, as some of my materials talk about, as it, you know, engages with looking for indigenous survivance, like looking for embedded slave narratives. It's like there are some things that are unknowable, and the unknowability doesn't have to be made legible. It doesn't have to be made legible, especially to, you know, a kind of white US based, you know, cis, hetero, you know, middle class and above like audience. And it doesn't have to be made legible to me. And that's something I really struggle with, because my own orientation is like deep nerdery, where I want to know like all of the details about everything always, like forever, many tabs in many windows with all of the research. But there's a limit to what one is able to know, and there's a limit, I feel like, to what one is not only able to say but should say. But I don't necessarily know where that line is, because that line is situationally, culturally, spatially, temporally dependent, you know, on what is, well, Serene, that's a really good question. Is partiality a resistance full of holes? Like, yes, you know, like if we want to think about like glissant and like poetics of relation and opacity, which is, you know, it's like everything, and this is something I wrestle with a lot, like, and have wrestled with since I did like my first MFA in Iowa, thinking about like accessibility, like whether like my writing is accessible, like whether my thought process is accessible, and understanding accessibility both as a way to reach more people than exist in like scholarly circles, but also the call to accessibility is in some ways like a call for transparency that's very much grounded in like a white supremacist understanding of like how much of me should be accessible to everyone else. And so that opacity, I feel like, is something that can be a really generative place to think about doing cultural work, particularly if one is working with archival materials. Like, I feel like part of the Monte refusal that Ramirez is talking about is like grounded in this kind of understanding of opacity, and in, you know, where, you know, in that first image, she's talking about, you know, like the women offering the cup of coffee, where that refusal might not be legible to people who just see the typology. Like, there, you know, opacity is not just being, it's not just creating this like impenetrable wall where you're refusing for any knowledge to be transmitted. Opacity for me just means that like that information is not for everyone. Like, some people are able to like decode or see through like the opacity to like get to what the point is. Like, sometimes the opacity is the point, but it can be not a test, but a way of talking to a specific audience, while also like saying what one needs to say in public. Because like talking in public, being a public person as a Black person, like thinking about the hyper visibility and the invisibility, it's like opacity feels like a necessary tool in one's toolkit in order to say the things that one needs to say, with the understanding that, you know, you don't want to get like doxxed by white supremacists. Like, you don't want to, you know, that's like a really like extreme example, but, you know, sometimes when you're wanting to say what one needs to say in public, it like requires a level of subterfuge. It requires a level of refusal, a level of opacity that enables one to talk directly to the people who share something with you.
I would even put it more basically. I think that because we're focusing on resistance, which is good. It's kind of an aesthetic choice that we're making. But I think to really kind of realistically look at the archive, the main thing is survival, right? Is the way that people navigated social death and the impossibility of surviving, and actually impossibly somehow survived, and here we are, right? So we can read all of those gestures as resistance, but they're not all resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Maroon slave catchers is not resistance, right? Carib jungle police is not resistance, but it is survival. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm really interested in this aspect of your project of the true indigeneity of the Black Carib, like Garifuna people, right? Like, that is indigenous survivance, and it's complicated, and it's not a great man heroic narrative. It's a series of wars. It's navigating the colonial mechanisms. It's all these different circulations of, like you're saying, the postcards and the domestication of the landscape. And during industrialization, this domestication served to kind of speed up dollar diplomacy and the Monroe Doctrine and all this other stuff. And it all ties into this, production of a kind of ripe interior space to be drawn from, right? And it's not a past thing, it's ongoing, right? It happens again in the 60s to the 80s in the kind of post-colonial moment when the Caribbean is enfolded into the kind of third world tourist industry, right? So in that context, it kind of reverberates again. So opacity is necessary. It's a demand that we make of everyone. Everyone should demand the right to have things that are private about themselves. That's obvious. But opacity is also more of an aesthetic thing too. It's about honoring these maybe more problematic navigations and these more equivocal, like when Ramirez is asking of her audience to resonate with her desire to read resistance into the assimilation and respectability of her family. That's a really interesting and even maybe problematic question, right? Like, is that resistance? Well, it doesn't matter because they survived. So in a sense, it has to be resistance because somehow did the impossible feat of getting through social death for that generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my main proposal is we should maybe define what resistance means. If it's not just survival, it sounds like we're talking about something else, maybe more aesthetic too.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I like about Monte refusal is that refusal stops short of resistance for me. Refusal feels like something that can happen in connection with surviving, even if it's not necessarily, doing the work of subverting very hegemonic understandings of humanity and what's possible. The family, I appreciate that, she offers these 3 types of Monte refusal, and that her family's own, let me get to it, that her family's own kind of refusal that she's talking about. She says, in the family portraits, members of the Oleo clan, like other non-white families in the Americas, took recourse to the performance and visuality of respectability as their refusal of the foundational tenets of Blackness in the Atlantic world as abject, hypercorporeal, and savage. And, respectability politics from a 21st century vantage point, I feel like still a thing that people are trying to put on other people, but a lot of people have thrown it in the trash with good reason. At the same time, if we're thinking about, respectability politics in this, photograph from 1962, the way that respectability is being used to refuse to embody a hegemonic understanding of Blackness, it's not resistance, but it's refusal. And I feel like there's something in that difference that's very interesting to me. As I think that you're talking about, Manuel, it's this desire to put everything under the umbrella of resistance when not everything was resistance, when sometimes acts were, as obviously bad as being a slave catcher, as killing indigenous, Amerindigenous
Buffalo
people.
Soldier, whatever, yes.
Exactly, where you're you're embodying the nationalistic, militaristic, heteropatriarchal grossness. But there is still something there that's doing the work of subversion at the same time that it's actually embodying the thing that's being subverted. And I do think that how do we make room for that? How do we talk about that? Both from when we're thinking about archives, but also when we're talking about our own lived experience and our own cultural products in the 21st century. Refusal in this case, I feel is a really nice is a productive way of thinking about it, because not everything is resistance. I'm of 2 minds of the notion that my very existence is the resistance. It's that's a little too pat, it's a little too easy, and it elides the necessity of doing, I think, more work than just existing in my body, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Monte refusal is a kind of opacity. It's an instance of opacity. And when she's reading these archives of visual photography, she's understanding that it's opaque to her, that she's not from these specific rural places, right? And that she's reading desire into them. And so the refusal is not just of the colonial archive, it's also of her desire, right? She's coming up against Monte refusal as well. And I know that she's elaborating on this in a book that will talk about her specific rural histories. So that'll be interesting to look at. And so, yeah, Monte refusal is a kind of opacity, right? It's a threat to the colonial metropole, colonial center's order, because it's a bunch of untrackable fugitive people, right? And Ramirez talks about their gaze, specifically the gaze of men, as being something that white colonizers had never seen before, right? Just the kind of freedom that they saw in those gazes that haunted them or something. So to think of opacity, again, it's not always resistance or even refusal. It's just opacity. It's hard to read.
Yeah.
It's opaque. The surface is not transparent, right?
Right.
So it's an aesthetic. It's a poetic of relation. Yeah, it's for Glissant, it's a kind of demand for mutual respect, right? Leave Plato to Athens, etc. Leave Kant to Königsberg. He's got all this kind of stuff, right?
Kelly has a comment. Kelly, would you like to share your thoughts?
Sorry, I was muted. I was thinking more back to when alea was sort of talking about the need to be accessible or the pressure to be accessible or legible, and thinking about how I think there's this kind of pressure to show reasoning or show evidence or something. And I'm just thinking about the times where something actually feels quite clear, but is only opaque because you're forced to explain it in a discourse where it doesn't belong, or that is not its own, if that makes sense. And so, for example, thinking about, having a kind of effective clarity about a situation or an effective charge that feels self-evident in some senses, but that is difficult to put into the kind of discourse of evidentiary support that you would need in an academic article traditionally, right? And so what is it? I'm really attracted to Hartman taking effective relation to material as a legitimate form of knowledge and a legitimate way of encountering material, and also not necessarily trying to translate it into something else in order to do that legitimate, to make it legitimate. So I was just thinking about that more, about like how I might not be able to tell you why I know something about a photograph, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a kind of knowledge about it, right? Which is my experience of it. So.
I know that we have, it's about 2:42 West Coast time. And so I also want to make space for questions, for comments, for, other folks to continue to say things that they feel like they want to say. Sorry, it's like the freshman composition teacher in me who's just like, well, and now we should, but also if you don't want to say anything, that's fine too. I feel like we haven't talked about your lecture yet. I mean, I don't know if you call it a lecture or a talk, or how you want to describe it, but that was so.
Whatever works.
Okay. I'm still wrestling with terminology and what to call certain things in my work, even though naming is problematic in a lot of ways. But I found your thinking through the work of Nunez in relation to Christina Sharp's In the Wake to be so generative and thoughtful and engaging. And I guess I wonder if you mind like talking a little bit about how you came to that project, but also like how you decided on the format that the talk chose, or even like how you decided on like a talk as the form that that research and that engagement would take.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that. This video or lecture, whatever you want to call it, was commissioned by the Black Feminist Kitchen's Black Feminist Summer School 2020 project. It's a project that this collective does every summer. It's run by Ebony Oldham. They used to live in Portland, and I think they live in Columbus, Ohio now, I believe. And so this is a great 3-day kind of summer school of live digital, in this case digital because of COVID, panels, artist talks, different kinds of workshops and stuff, as well as non-live offerings. So this video was one of the non-live offerings. And the theme for the summer school of 2020 was Christina Sharp's In the Wake, right? And so I was interested, kind of in the same sense that I'm interested in this context, to think of thinking of sound and sound, memory of sound in the body as a kind of alternative archive, and thinking of Nunez's stewardship in the context of reduction to folklore and transaction, right? Embodied by this exploitative anti-Black relationship with Quinito Mendes, the merengue musician. And so the form of the video comes out of that. And I structured it, I put the colonial history right next to the definitions of the religious context, because I thought that those were related. Our definitions of these things come from colonizers, or are in a close proximity to that. They're in struggle with that. And then I talked specifically about Nunez and Mendez's theft of her work, and then some of the ways that she repairs and does self-care. If Mendez, as she says, killed her through this reduction to transaction, she does a kind of self-eulogization. She sings of herself and of her town in the context of the deities in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which are the Loa, or the Misterios. And so my familiarity with Nunez is just from culture. I mean, she's one of the most famous Dominican musicians currently. And that started with the 1990s recording, 1997 recording, Ogumbalenyo. And it really started to come into prominence in her work in terms of a public visibility after this UNESCO World Heritage Site declaration of the town that her village is in, Villamella. And so that was in 2001, right? So these are pretty close. And then since then, I mean, she's just been extremely famous, but always dealing with, underpayment and reduction to the folklore and the ways in which this concept de-Africanizes and despiritualizes her practices, right? And so I was, when I first encountered her, I was aware of her spiritual context, but I didn't appreciate it as deeply as I could have. I mean, I was so young, right? And I was raised Pentecostal. So Pentecostal Protestantism is hostile to both Catholicism and African spirituality. So that's something I had to work through in my life, right? Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of ground my own understanding of my appreciation of her work and just share that with the public, because I think it's really important when we engage this work, which, it is, Agumbalenyo and Lo Motorita are like the Dominican national anthems in a sense, right? So we can't allow that to be reduced to folklore or some sort of vestigial or past or childlike thing. Like Quinito Mendes positions African spirituality as a childlike thing, a thing of nostalgia of the past. So yeah, that's kind of the impetus of that video. Thank you for asking.
Thank you for answering. I found it super, super fascinating.
It's also, to tie back into my maternal lineage, it ties into this project of Bartii is also home to different Afro-traditional stuff and Afro-Catholic stuff. And so my grandma's parents were not only crypto-Jewish apparently, but what I had known them as before is still true. They were devotees of the Virgin of High Grace, La Virgen de Altagracia, and my grandmother's name is Altagracia. So she's kind of the patron saint of the Dominican Republic, as I mentioned in that video. But her African presence as a round or a vuelta or a facet of the deity Esili, the specific facet Esili Alayla, is the one that's syncretized with the Virgin of High Grace. And so that gets erased a lot, and it's erased in my family as well. So digging into the Catholic history of that lineage is also important and interesting to me as a kind of dimension of their Afro-Sephardic geographical and racial identities, right? So the work around Nunez and her specific context of Villamella and Matalosinios village, it's kind of inspiring me to do work in a different context or informing that other context.
Candida, would you like to share your thoughts out loud? Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for leading this discussion. I just find it really so insightful on a number of levels, and I do appreciate very much hearing from you individually and the discussion between you two and between your texts. I think it's really interesting. And what I typed out was that I appreciate it and want to go over the text again more closely after hearing this discussion, bearing in mind your comments on temporality and specifically thinking about that as it relates to the making of and the longevity of these primary sources and where they exist, whether that's in our minds as knowing that they exist or once existed, or in physical collections as items that are tended to or not tended to within those archives and special collections. And thinking about the physical object like manuscripts, photos, or other media as something that can be, I guess, they're physical objects or the less tangible states of existence, in that they are embodied in our minds in some way. Does that make sense? So that's all. Thank you.
I have just a follow-up question. So when you're thinking about kind of like the physical object, but then also the kind of less tangible state of existence, you're not necessarily thinking about like less tangible IRT, like something being like digital. You're thinking about it being something that is collected in a way that's embodied, that perhaps only exists within the body.
I mean, yes, yeah, like less tangible, not as in non-physical but virtual, but less tangible as in non-physical any longer as an object in the world or in any digital state, but within our minds.
Mm-hmm. So something that we know existed, but that no longer exists.
Right, no exists or existed. You know, maybe we don't have access to see these items, but they can be described to us in some way or another, or yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Also, hi, nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Could I guess this is not really a question, but this is more like this obviously so much of what we speak about here is in some sense metaphorical with the archive. And towards that end, what I've discovered is like what has been most fruitful to me, like listening to you all, is like thinking about the very nature of walking into or understanding or physically sort of being within the archival space, if we're talking about institutional archives. And towards that end, I kind of want to narrate a couple of experiences I've had in thinking about slowness and the nature of the accumulation of knowledge and how it registers. So I am a historian of coloniality in the British Empire, but specifically looking at India. And I've spent hundreds of hours in the National Archives of India in Delhi and in Lucknow and other places, like basically requesting archival documents and either getting them or getting the wrong document, or knowing that they're in such a state of disrepair that I might not actually be able to go through it. And of course, the last category being the British have already evacuated any important document and I'll have to fly to London to get that thing. And that has happened more times than I can count. And what's interesting about that experience for me is, while I had a sense of frustration going through that process, and I will continue to have that as I work with the archives in India, is the particular language of scholarly engagement with India versus London. I typically end up working alongside a lot of people from Great Britain as well as America, scholars who hang out in the archives, who ultimately have chai together, maybe around 3 or 4, and everyone will complain endlessly about how slow Indian archives are, how mismanaged they are, how deeply disorganized they are. At the same time that they nostalgize a particular sort of pre-archival India that they are sort of in charge of recovering through this process. And what is like particularly salient to me in all of these hundreds, thousands of moments I've had like this is that the very classed circumstances within which the Indian bureaucracy has formed are utterly taken out of context or utterly invisibilized. Like as alea, as you beautifully mentioned earlier, and I don't think it's mentioned enough, I feel like I need to make a poster of it, the people who actually order the archives, who sweep the archives, who create order out of these places that can potentially be of chaos, they're either invisibilized if they're truly effective, or they're visibilized if they're seen as some sort of an impediment to our objective. So, I mean, I don't really have a question there, but I just want to note that in terms of temporality, the very nature with which efficiency is defined in archival retrieval is also remarkably, in certain circumstances, colonially determined and bureaucratically determined as well. Thanks.
Sorry, just like, damn. That's like a super, super helpful perspective. And it makes me think of, I took a, God, like everybody has been so like brilliant today. I feel like I was super nervous. I was like, what if people don't talk? But people are probably going to talk. So like, what if I'm not brilliant? But everybody has been really brilliant. So thank you. But that reminds me of a class I took, and I submitted like one kind of little bit at the beginning from like a historiography seminar focused on the Caribbean that I took this past quarter. And we, because of COVID, of course, like had to be in Zoom for 3 hours on Tuesday, which sucked, but it also meant that we got to have visitors almost every single week, with like visits with the people whose books and articles we were reading, which was actually like incredibly generous on their part to offer their time, but also super helpful in terms of thinking about, you know, as the only kind of artist in this class of like history grad students, it was very helpful to have some access to people who we could ask questions of. But Rashmi, what you're saying about the kinds of different kind of affective approaches to doing archival work, whether it's in like the metropole in London, you know, going to Kew Gardens, or like whether it's in the kind of colony, whether that's the Caribbean or in India, and the kind of different, like not only like the difference in number of people who are doing research in like these particular sets of places, but also like the way that people describe that affective experience of doing research. It was so interesting to have you kind of articulate the, you know, the like communal fetch session that happens like every afternoon, where it's like on one part, you know, complaining about the archives and staffing, and on the other part, like this like waxing nostalgic about this past India that may or may not have ever existed ever, and the kind of responsibility that certain scholars feel to like bring this past imaginary India to life. One of the scholars, and it's like I'm skimming my notes, one of the scholars who visited our class mentioned that, you know, her experience of doing archival research was like her whole project was kind of exploded by the fact that she like came upon a piece of archival material that wasn't where it was supposed to be. And that kind of like radically shifted her project and what she thought she was doing. And that was because she was doing research outside of the kind of metropole. And so that steered her to start looking for, and it's like, I can't exactly find it, but I'll like add it to the doc once I like look through my notes. So I can give you like a more fleshed out understanding of this anecdote. So it's not just like kind of haphazard, a half anecdote, a half anecdote, if you will. But, you know, she ended up doing a lot of research about the particular place that she was attempting to learn about, like in the islands that were around it. Because in those archives, she was able to find material that other scholars like had never seen, because they were busy only focusing on, well, I do my research in London, or in, you know, I do my research like wherever the archives are in Spain, and then I do my research in country, and then those are the places to find the things. But she was like, she had this revelatory experience because she started doing research in the circum-Caribbean, like in the other kind of places within the Caribbean, that enabled her to flesh out not only a more complex view of the relations that she was trying to map, but that also gave her access to resources that other people had not yet found or thought about or looked at. And, you know, I say that not as a way of, you know, encouraging accessing archives that other people haven't touched so that one can get the scholarly jump on them, but because there's, I think, there's a way of thinking about one's engagement with archives and archival materials, if one is doing it in a kind of like official like research capacity, that really closes off the ability to understand narratives in a capacious way. And so Ramirez talks about, you know, closed narratives and open narratives. And on some levels, it's like if we're approaching our archival research in a closed manner, we're only going to really, I think, be able to understand and perhaps articulate closed narratives, or maybe those open narratives will be more difficult for us to find. And I also, you know, I feel like we've talked a lot about institutional archives, and I don't want to, because I feel like Nunez in particular, you know, where she, you know, especially in the moments where she's like self-mythologizing herself and creating her own archive, you know, in song, it's like, and because we also have talked earlier about archives in the body and archives in memory, it's like, I don't want anybody to walk away from this conversation thinking that we think, or I think, that archives can only be in institutions. They exist in other places, but because we are often engaging with archives materially on the internet or in institutions, I feel like it's helpful to consider the ways that we reinscribe colonial thought and colonial practices with our own kind of closed approaches. And what you said about the people who help special collections or archives to run, and the ways in which they're invisible if they're effective, or they're like hyper visible if they're deemed ineffective, was so brilliantly stated, Rashmi. I appreciate that articulation and intervention.
Thank you, Leah. That was great. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I was really struck by the connotations of enforcement and how you describe slowness. I think that's really interesting, right? And even as there is this generative possibility within these mismanaged, they're more obscure archives, and even as we talked before about the generative possibilities of slow thought, the idea that slowness is enforced and that the theater of bumbling of colonial or post-colonial bureaucracy is like part of these tools, these logics of oppression. And I think that's really interesting because, you know, the Shorma book talks about slowness in that context. Like slowness became assimilated into mindfulness and into increasing worker productivity for the specific leisure time of the top white collar workers, right? So yeah, the idea that slowness is enforced, we can kind of hold that alongside the generative possibilities of slow thought and slow data. You know, there's a kind of equivocality there.
Absolutely. And to add to like your incredibly rich conversation on like the gradations between refusal, rejection, and resistance and survival, and the other sort of the multiplicities of existing within bureaucratic systems or non-bureaucratic systems. One thing I'd say is with the enforced slowness of working with these post-colonial archives it was not a rejection nor a refusal nor a survival. They had a guaranteed paycheck. It was more like a fuck off, I actually don't give a shit, which is really quite lovely to think about. Like it's not even a strategy necessarily, but it's an utterly different prioritization of the nature of material and your relationship to your job. So I just want to add that in there a little bit as well. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
I think that I just want to add thank you again from the CAS for this all. This was a very rich discussion. And I really appreciate, it's just a short comment, just appreciate the reflections on the archive and asking us to not only really consider the sources embedded in the archive, but the space of itself and what it means for our understanding of history, for our scholarly practices. I think that is useful. And so that is just my own conversation, because I think for me personally, you fall into the trap. You do the 1, 2, 3. You collect your sources, you write, you hopefully like publish. But I think the reflection on what the space is or what's in the space and how you need to re-envision or revisit the sources and complicate the sources embedded in this space of itself. I think it's a useful conversation, and I'm like just reflecting on my own experiences in graduate school. I think it's useful and it should be highlighted even more, and so that's why I'm especially more appreciative for the space and the conversation that existed today.
Thank you. Thank you for your work in putting it together. I think also, you know, like Kelly earlier, I think like way back, you used the word revision, and then you were like, maybe not revision. And then Dellyssa, you know, used the word reflection. And I feel like, you know, I don't stand many people, but like the writer Kiese Lehman, who is so great as like a teacher and as a thinker. You know, he is a really big proponent of revision, of like the importance of revision as a tool in like the toolkit of cultural workers, but also like revision as like a necessary like kind of ethical like necessary in one's like ethical toolkit as well, the kind of constant reevaluation, not only of one's work, but also of one's actions and of one's like the way that one is acting in relation to other people. And I feel like, you know, there's not a lot of time often for revision and reflection. It's, you know, the 1, 2, 3, as Dellyssa said, and making space for thought and for sitting with things and for being able to come back to them, I feel like is really, really important. And I have trouble with revision because it's hard, and because sitting with the same material over and over again can be really complicated in a lot of ways, but I think that it's really necessary, especially if we're dealing with archival materials, either that have personal, ancestral, genealogical meaning, or if we're using them as inspiration, you know, inspiration for other works that we do, you know, in terms of scholarship or cultural production, being able to like sit with something and reflect and revise is essential, I think, to avoid attempting to avoid reinscribing the types of overly simplistic narratives that are very, very easy, you know, very easy to grasp, or very easily within our initial grasps when we're starting to work with something. You know, the typologies are always at the surface, or like readily at hand. And to do the work of trying to get more complicated than that is lifelong and requires continual engagement with not only the sources, but also with one's approach to those sources.
But also with this necessity of finding time too. I mean, that's the kind of difficulty, right? Or not difficulty, but that's where strategy comes in terms of counter routines or counter architectures of stolen time, right? Like we have to steal some time back, right? Most often labor time or study time if you're a student. So yeah, finding time is the difficult thing. Well, no, the difficult thing is the reflection that you're describing and the constant revision and the unfinished nature of the project. It's lifelong. But even before finding the luxury to do that is the time, right?
Absolutely. Being able to find that time, steal that time, take that time, but also not feel guilty about it, to not feel, you know, my therapist always says, if you're gonna not do something that you feel like you should do and then spend the time that you're not doing the thing, feeling bad about not doing the thing, it's like you just like shat all over. She wouldn't say shit all over, but you did just, you know, you just shat all over like the time that you're purposefully taking off. You know, so if you're gonna take off the time, really take off the time, as opposed to using it as a period of self-flagellation for not doing the initial task that you're not doing. And so part of it is, you know, finding that time, but also kind of like, it's part of it is like, is mental as well, because our understanding of time is so ingrained in us. And so even if we're taking and stealing the time, we might not be utilizing the time in the most, you know, productive, generative, you know, like enriched kind of way, if that makes sense.
Anyone else? Any comments?
Yes, thank you guys for having such a wonderful conversation. It was really generative. I mean, I feel like I have to revisit the text, re-listen to this recording, because I think a lot of the themes are things that I'm actually been thinking about in my practice as well. And I don't have in terms of a lot to say, but in terms of like, just in terms of my commentary, is that I just feel that I think slowing down, like the notion of like slowing down and rethinking in terms of your ideas or revisiting these different things, I think that is radical, because I mean, we live in such a, and I think the pandemic sort of kind of created this weird situation where we are in some ways kind of forced to contend with time and aloneness or what have you, and in this sort of like virtual sort of vacuum that we exist in. And so you're kind of like, you don't have a lot of noise per se, so you can kind of, in somewhat kind of, the pandemic sort of kind of helped create a situation where you can slow down to again rethink a lot of ideas that you think. Because what I'm, in terms of for myself, what I'm realizing is that I have these ideas, but they're not really my own. And so it's like, how can I able to sort of like, where is, find the root of what everything is? And you guys, just in the way how you guys were thinking and sort of like, just sort of like going back and forth in terms of text was so, just kind of was so enriching, that I, again, is another confirmation for me that the labor in which I want to do, that not to sort of like, it's worth the work, it's worth the time to put it in, and it's worth the work. Because sometimes you always feel guilty, like, oh no, maybe I need to kind of move on to the next thing, versus sort of kind of like sitting and like a Hartman, and really sort of really understand what you're doing and contending with all of that, with everything around you. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it's a lot. And I'm really, again, very grateful for your scholarship, both you and Manuel. I think that just continue, because it's very, very inspiring. So that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you. That's so generous and kind. And I really love the sentence you said, like, I have these ideas, but they're not really my own. It's really difficult to figure out one's programming, like what are the different scripts, like what are the different programs that are kind of running inside of one's head, and what does one like not actually buy, but just does because it's just what one has been doing. It's habit. And it's, the pandemic has made visible all of the cracks that we know to exist and has widened them, but it has also created this very strange relationship with time for a lot of people. Not everyone. Some people have had to go on with their working lives because their time is what facilitates other people to be able to have this experience of the pandemic that is like slowness. But for folks who are experiencing a different embodied time, I feel like a lot of things have become apparent as habit that are not necessarily what one actually believes anymore, or thinks, or how one wants to operate. It's definitely a time for, I think, reevaluation and reflection.
I love that bit about guilt. It's really good. This guilt can really cloud the analysis. When you've already achieved, stealing or taking back time or reclaiming your time, and then you're still dealing with this kind of, I don't want to call it unproductive because that's kind of weird in this context, but self-inflicted wounds of guilt, right? Very locked into a Christianized mindset, even if it feels secular.
Absolutely, that I should be doing X, even though I'm doing Y. And so even though I'm going to play Skyrim for 6 hours, I'm gonna not enjoy it because I'm actually gonna be thinking about how I should be reading, or I should be doing this volunteer work, or I should be doing laundry, or I should be doing X, Y, or Z, as opposed to just playing my 6 hours of an RPG and enjoying it. It doesn't, and I definitely feel and like resonate with your shying away from like wanting to make it about productivity, right? Because it's like not about that. But if we're going to have leisure time, if we're going to take that time, whether it's for leisure, whether it's reflection or revision, not feeling like that time is like that time is better used in a different way. I feel like that's giving into this, like, time is money, and if you're not utilizing it to be the most productive, then you're failing. And that's, you know, not the type of failure I feel like that one is engaging with when one is being like slow in a particular way that enables the type of failure you talked about earlier. And that's like, I don't know, a lifelong struggle. It's like, you know, the guilt and the productivity and like what productivity means, you know, that's like something I wrestle with all the time.
I found the whole like temporal publics thing to be very healing in that context. And I just found this term thanks to you. So I'm really excited to dig into it and explore what else it does to me, right? So whoever mentioned like the somatic experience of production and circulation and metaphor, the colonial historian of Britain or India, I forget the person's name, but
yeah, Rashmi,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I found that really compelling. Thank you.
Thank you, Alea, Manuel, on unbelievably generous conversation and discussion. I'm just going to second several comments that, like, going back to these readings after, you know, hearing your thoughts and just being part of the conversation will be very like healing and meaningful. And I feel that after this conversation, a lot of people will feel less guilty to relax over the weekend. Just like yeah, have some like present time. Yeah, thank you so much. And Dellyssa, thank you. And CAS, Anne, if Anne is still here. You're all doing amazing work. Hi.
Thank you. We love you.
Thank you
Thank
everyone.
you all for your work, Dellyssa and Natasha and Anne, and the audience and the participants, of course, and alea especially. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to see some familiar faces and names and to get introduced to some new people as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and we will be sending the follow-up email connecting everyone, so you can continue conversations as you wish, and we will share the recording once it's done. But yeah, thank you so much. This is really amazing, and hope we stay in conversation.
Yeah, there's a really good trick to relaxing. It's called sending money to dark-skinned Black people. It works really well.
Spend that unemployment money.
Yeah,